I'm not going to be doing a talk today on what it means to be a father or even what it means to be a man. But I am going to give fathers here something to think about. And it's something that's very important. So here goes. How many of you here have seen Monty Python's The Meaning of Life? Okay, a number of you have, and just from what I know of Reverend Mark, I'm sure he has as well. But that has nothing to do with my talk. It just happens that my talk has the same title. Now you're going to have to follow me in this. I'm going to take you somewhere, but it's going to take a little while. How many of you know the artist Paul Gauguin? Okay, quite a few. Paul Gauguin lived from 1848 to 1903, and for a short time, for actually only 9 weeks, he was the roommate of Vincent van Gogh. They lived in the city of Arles, France, in what they called the Yellow House. He referred, a lot of people referred to him as an impressionist, but he referred to himself as a post-impressionist. He didn't group himself with the impressionists, and even preferred to be referred to as a, quote, symbolist. Now, Gauguin, from the age of 11 through 16, was a Catholic seminary student. And he was student of the Bishop of Orleans, France. Now, I'm going to diverge here. Now, you know New Orleans? New Orleans was named after Orleans in France. And the reason why was because up until 1803, the French owned everything from Montana all the way down to Louisiana in our country. They owned it all. And what changed it was in 1903 they did what we've probably all heard of as the Louisiana Purchase, where we bought from France that portion of our country. And that's why New Orleans is called New Orleans. It was named after the city of Orleans in France. Well, that's where he was a student, and he was a student of the Bishop of Orleans. And this bishop had written a catechism for the boys that he taught. And in this catechism, they were to ponder questions such as, what is grace? What is death? And the three most fundamental questions in this catechism were, where does humanity come from? Where is it going? And how does humanity proceed? What's interesting is late in his life, in fact 6 years before he died, Gauguin, at that point, Gauguin had since abandoned his faith years earlier. But while he was in Tahiti, he painted this huge painting, and the title of it was, Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? So that harkened back to those days when he was just between the age of 11 and 16, taking his catechism class. And though he asked those questions, he didn't leave any answers. Another famous painter thought he knew, and it was Pablo Picasso, because he wrote this: the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. But you know, some can't even give their gifts away. If we think of Gauguin's one-time roommate, Vincent van Gogh, in his lifetime, he had made 900 paintings. And of those 900 paintings, in his lifetime, he only sold one. And yet, his portrait which is called Self-Portrait with a Bandaged Ear, sold for $90 million. And he couldn't sell it in his own lifetime. And you know what the deal is with the bandaged ear? The story goes that on the evening of December 23rd, which was the day before Christmas Eve, and there's a difference of opinion in this. Some people say he cut off all his ear, some say he cut off a portion of his ear. But I've actually read the newspaper that was published the next day in the news in that town, and it said he cut off his ear, the whole thing. But anyway, despite that, what he did is he took the ear, he went to a brothel where he had a lady friend, maybe just a woman friend, I should say. And he had it wrapped up in a cloth, and he gave it to her. Of course, she was horrified when she opened it. He went away, was at the point of bleeding to death when the police found him. And when that happened, you know, this happened while Gauguin was living with him. At that point, Gauguin hightailed it out of there and never saw him again for the rest of his life. So I just throw that in there, where Pablo Picasso is saying the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away. But I just like to say that some people don't even get the chance to give it away. You know. Anyway, so we're going to take a break from these depressing facts and listen to some other answers to the questions. For instance, this says, in our life, there is a single color, as one on an artist's palette, which provides the meaning of life and art. It is the color of love. Now, Marc Chagall was a Jewish painter, and so you can see he brings the color in there too, but he says ultimately the color is the color of love. Viktor Frankl, the next quotation, was a Jew who survived the Holocaust. He was in concentration camps. And he wrote a very famous book, which was called Man's Search for Meaning. I bet today it's titled The Human Search for Meaning. But anyway, what he said was, what matters is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. Okay? Erich Fromm. Have most of you heard of Erich Fromm? He was a very famous psychologist. Anyway, he wrote, there is only one meaning of life, the act of living itself. Then Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monk, and an author and a social activist, he spoke out against the Vietnam War. He says, we do not find the meaning of life by ourselves alone, we find it with another. And then Leo Tolstoy was the Russian author. He was also a pacifist. And he says the sole meaning of life is to serve humanity. I think we have one more, yeah. And finally this. My dog doesn't worry about the meaning of life. She may worry if she doesn't get fed, but she doesn't sit around worrying about whether she will get fulfilled or liberated or enlightened. As long as she gets some food and a little affection, her life is fine. And that's by Jocko Beck. I don't even know who that is, but I thought it sounded great. Okay. Now, from something, now this is from something that Reverend Mark probably read while he was in Catholic seminary. This is today's Catholic Catechism, and this is what it says. Faith is man's response to God, who reveals himself and gives himself to man, at the same time bringing man a superabundant light as he searches for the ultimate meaning of life. I guess women don't need to search. Did you notice it all was man and man, he, all that stuff? Yeah. And then it says, then it also says in the Catechism, and God has provided the definitive superabundant. You know, they're really into this superabundant thing. We're into abundance, right? But they're into superabundance. So it says, God has provided the definitive superabundant answer to the question that man asks himself about the meaning and purpose of life. But they don't say what the answer is. They just say that God gives it to them, but never says what it is. Well, anyway, this month at Spirit Wind, as you might remember from the announcements, we've been talking about existentialism. And existentialism is a philosophy that takes the very fact of our existence as its starting point. And that's where the word existentialism comes from, existence. Existentialism teaches that the meaning of life is not derived from the Bible or God's will for our life. Rather, it is we ourselves who determine what the meaning of our lives are. Though he was not an existentialist, I should say, how many of you know Joseph Campbell or heard of him? He was probably the greatest mythologist in the 20th century. Though he was not an existentialist, look what he has to say. I think it's very much in line with what the existentialists were saying. Life is without meaning. You bring the meaning to it. The meaning of life is whatever you ascribe it to be. And I think that puts it right in with Unity's 5 principles, because principle number 3 is we can create our own experience of life in accordance with the thoughts we consistently hold. So in other words, their Unity's saying as well, we create the meaning of our lives, and we create it in terms of the thoughts in our mind that we consistently hold. Now that puts a different spin on what Joseph Campbell wrote, because it links our experience or meaning of life to the thoughts we consistently hold. And I believe that that's what Unity is all about. It's about changing our way of thinking in order to change our experience of the world. So think well, and let us think on these things. So.